Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
I've been pretty unorthodox. I've been as hungry as I can possibly be. I don't want to be the man that I was, and I don't want to be the man that I am right now. I want to become the man that I'm supposed to be. So prayerfully that'll happen sometime down the road.
All right. Yeah. Well, I have to put that in the podcast now, too. You had to just say that. That was like gold right there.
Yes. We should all actually have that expectation.
Yes.
You know, like just continued growth.
Yes.
We're all in process.
Father, we thank you for this day and this time. And Lord, I just thank you for the opportunity to visit. Lord, I just pray that you would calm my heart. And Lord, I just pray that you would allow me to be sensitive to those that might be listening. And Lord, I pray that there might be healing found for the things that you have done and you do through others. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Yes, Lord.
Amen. Amen.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. Today we have Steve on the show. Steve is a former abuser and now dedicates his time to helping other abusive men that want to change. He is also a leader at Celebrate Recovery. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you.
Hi, Steve. It's Karen. Nice to meet you.
You as well.
So can you start out telling us a little of your story and how you were abusive?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm very humbled to visit with you. As we get started, before I go on, just out of sensitivity to those that were injured by my words and actions, I'll try to use some general descriptors in an attempt to avoid any re-traumatization for those individuals. I was married for over 20 years, and together we have 4 daughters. And without making the connection from anger to abuse, I'd often said that I struggled with anger for my entire adult life. I think I chose the word struggled because I knew that my anger often led to outbursts that were harmful to myself and to others. I knew I had a problem, and I was generally aware that it affected others. Yet I was really focused on myself. I don't think I ever really thought of how it affected others. And I didn't realize that it was abusive, and it was. I also think as I process that, it's appropriate to point out that I now realize that it wasn't just the outbursts of anger or the fits of rage that caused hurt and harm and damage. Those outbursts weren't the only things that were abusive. I extensively used sarcasm. I was often really critical of others. My parenting style was authoritative. It was overly focused on performance and achievement. It was demanding. I said things in a really harsh, demeaning, and disrespectful way. And I had those outbursts. I would intimidate with the volume of my voice, the crassness of my words, the intonations of those words, body language, and my physical presence. That was in the home with my family, with my wife and our children. And collectively, it was abusive. And I was abusive. So back to chronology then, I'm aware that these things began early on in my relationship with my wife. I can remember one episode in particular, which plays back in my mind as terrifying with the words that I was using, the volume that I was using, and the intensity of my body language. The rage even included physical abuse of one of our pets. And after that episode, my wife came to me and asked if we could go to counseling. And I declined. And now looking back, I can even appreciate the very gentle way that she approached me and how she was trying to get me to see that it wasn't just the outbursts. It was the way I was treating her in the times in between as well. There's another incident that I recall that happened 8 to 10 years later that included a physical interaction with one of our children. And then somewhere between 8 and 10 years ago, my behaviors further intensified. I sulked, I pouted, I belittled, and the episodes of rage became much more frequent. I still thought that my anger was the problem and didn't take the very logical walk of connection in which I would see the damage that was being done to those that I purported to love the most. In my selfishness, it felt better after I erupted, and I failed to recognize or see the collateral damage. I made excuses, and in other instances, simply justified my words and actions. And yet in the workplace, in my community, within our church involvement, I was perceived as having it all together. I don't know if I was viewed as gentle or kind by others, but I didn't have a negative reputation. That was to the outside world. At home, it was a pretty different story. I was abusive.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's got to be difficult. What was the turning point that made you decide that you needed to change and stop being abusive?
Wow. I think there were 3 turning points. Maybe the first one was the turning point. The next 2 helped push me on. First, my wife initiated an involuntary separation. She left a note for me when I returned to the house. And the way that I found the letter and the words that she used within the letter seemingly woke me up. It was in that moment that I realized I needed help and things truly needed to change. Secondly, after I began working with a licensed professional counselor, he had me do a homework activity, and he actually assigned me to watch the kids' movie Inside Out. And I remember doing so, and I finally made the connection of how my words and actions were affecting the feelings and the emotions and the thinking of our family members. And then third, after further work with my counselor, he lent me some materials to read, and I read those. And then I went a bit deeper, beyond my feelings and probably that rudimentary recognition of the feelings of others. And I realized that I needed to change my thinking and my attitudes and my beliefs. I began to believe what Lundy Bancroft wrote, paraphrased into some personal language. I wasn't abusive because I was angry. I was angry because I was abusive. At that point, I'd already been seeing a counselor for 4 or 5 months. I'd voluntarily self-enrolled in an anger management class. But with that revelation that I needed to change my thinking and my attitudes and my beliefs, I voluntarily enrolled in a batterer intervention program, sometimes called an abuser group or an offender program. And so I think taken together, those 3 things propelled me to keep working. I finished the offender program in 6 months, and then I began Celebrate Recovery at the conclusion of that program. And I think it was because of those 3 turning points.
So I'm curious, when you read like the Lundy Bancroft material, was that like a book you read, or like what is it that made you clicked with you?
It was. I read a couple of his books. In fact, I read 2 of them in sequence in about a week. And I think what clicked was I was following along and began to realize how my thinking, the way that I thought, was affecting my outlook or my attitudes, and was therefore affecting my beliefs about a given situation. And I don't know if it was his approach. I mean, certainly he's worked with abusive men for a very long time. And as I read those, I started to see that I needed help that was much, much deeper and really starting to affect those underlying components. And I read a couple of his books. And as I read those 2 books, I came to the conclusion that I needed that additional help. And that's then when I reached out to the program.
So what are some of the things that you continue to work on to make sure that you're genuinely putting effort into these changes?
As I reflect on that question, I think it's getting at what work I'm doing, not what activities I'm involved with. And I think that's a great way to phrase the question. I now see a counselor that specializes in working with abusive men. And I went through the 12 steps of Celebrate Recovery, and I apprenticed a couple of guys co-leading a step study. But those are the activities. What I'm working on continues to be finishing the deconstructive work of therapy and setting about the reconstructive work of the same. I found it really, really helpful to continue working on my thinking and my attitudes and my beliefs. I try to think on good things, which is helpful. I also try to think the best in situations. And I often do empathy exercises, walking a mile in someone else's shoes. I try to be more considerate of others and how they might feel, and maybe even what their differing perspectives are. I try to be more present. There are a number of things that I've learned with dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT strategies that I found are really helpful for building healthy relationships too. So mindfulness exercises can reduce my anxiety, which has been super helpful. But they can also be used to focus on the present in a conversation with a friend or a family member and making the whole interaction much more meaningful. And then I try to find things that I enjoy doing and achieve a little bit of balance. I enjoy reading, but I don't need to read all the time. I like hiking, but I don't need to make it a competition every time I go out for a walk.
Yeah.
And I enjoy watching sports, but I don't need to pick a team or get overly involved in the game every single time. And so doing things with friends and ensuring that I'm aware of what brings them joy is also helpful. So collectively, those are some of the things that I'm working on to make sure that I'm putting in the effort to affect change.
That's great.
Yeah,
You're
it is
putting
great.
forth that effort.
Yeah. So I heard that you had initially called Mike Forrester, who's our podcast number 4, after you listened to our podcast. Did you want to share anything about that conversation with Mike?
Yeah, I did. I was really moved by what Mike had to say in that podcast. And I was thinking about it and decided that I'd look him up. And I did so. And I initiated contact through the little form that he had on his website. And I shouldn't have been surprised, but I guess in some ways I was so surprised that he replied back right away, and we ended up visiting. And he was so gracious and kind. But there are really 2 things about that conversation I found helpful. First, I found him to be really supportive of seeking out resources that facilitate change. He's walking the journey of transformation, and I think he appreciates the value of counsel and group settings and education. And that conversation and his thoughts, that was really affirming. But next, and secondly, he was willing to challenge me a little bit. I don't remember the exact phrases now, but in essence, he encouraged me to take what I've learned and find ways to practice it in actual relationships. And the distance from the mind to the heart can be a really long one. And it's been that way for me. And Mike really challenged me to take that trek.
That's great that you have
Yeah.
someone that you can talk to about it. And yeah, what a great example he was on our podcast, just being able, humble himself and talking about it.
Yeah, because I think you were probably in a completely different place before you talked to him, right? You've really come leaps and bounds since that conversation, right? As far as
I pray that I have. I mean, I think as you go through the journey, I certainly know when I approached him, I'm still pretty hungry for resources and change, but I think it was that encouragement that he offered was really helpful. And then I also think it was his listening to be able to listen to what I was doing and see where there might be an area for improvement. And he was very gentle in doing so. And I just really appreciate it. So yeah, I think it certainly helped move me and continue to push me forward into some new areas.
Yeah, that is amazing that, we interviewed Mike. He's a wonderful person and it helped someone else.
Yeah.
Like that just is great.
That's the whole purpose of our podcast. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's great. So I hear that you now get calls from men and C-suite executives of companies that are abusive reaching out to help, to get some help with their abusive behavior. Do you want to elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, it's really humbling. I still have a lot of work to do, and I have areas that I know I need to work on. So to get a call from a C-suite executive or any other guy that's begun to recognize what they've been doing is abusive, it's really humbling that I might be able to be a resource. But beyond that, I've found that those guys that reach out and seek counsel, they're super open to suggestions related to doing the work of deconstruction and focusing on their own thoughts and attitudes and beliefs and maybe even trying to figure out what they might be and then beginning to reconstruct their behavioral patterns. But initially, I had a couple of churches that reached out to me that had some guys that they felt like might be in need of help. And those men that I called were just a little less interested in hearing about the work that I thought might be of assistance. And I think part of it is I've grown a little bit and realized we're each on an individual journey, but also felt like it would be helpful to change my approach a little bit. And so if someone asks about getting so-and-so help, I'll offer my phone number and then let that person in need of help reach out. And that has worked much better. And I find the conversations are a lot deeper. And it's been neat to see those individuals that are really interested in beginning the walk of changing what they've been doing as well.
Yeah, that way they have to take some initiation to see, like, just that way you can see some indication. Do they really want to get help, or are they kind of being coerced into it or forced into it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it was at Lundy Bancroft that said that, the percentage of abusive men that actually change is very small. But I just want to thank you so much for trying to help with that and help in this area, because you're doing something from a different approach.
Yeah.
And that not a lot of people do. And we just want to thank you for that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. If there's even if they can't completely get rid of all the behaviors, just even becoming less abusive it's a big deal. It's a big deal to me.
Yeah.
And to our listeners,
being willing to, look
because
at it.
the ways that you talked about the way you were at the beginning, all those years before you got help, is exactly what I experienced for 22 years. And that change hasn't happened on that end for me, but I appreciate what you're doing. Can you share the most important things you've learned that have helped you to stop abusing others? What are some of the most important things you've learned?
Well, in reflection, again, I want to be super sensitive to those that I've injured in the past when answering that question. Many years ago, prior to recovery, I used to say that I could never know how someone else feels, but I can seek to understand how they feel. And now I'm in a position that I'm a lot less confident in my ability to determine how someone feels. I prefer to ask an individual what they're feeling or how they're experiencing something and talk about that and listen to them. And that's a bit of a tangent, but it came to mind in thinking about the phrase, stop abusing others. But there's been quite a bit I feel like I've learned along the journey. One of the first ones that comes to mind is related to how ignorant I was about how I was behaving and how that affected others. Early on, after the separation from my family began, I remember telling others that I only had outbursts once in a while. And then I read something, and I can't remember exactly where, but it said something along the lines of an outburst of anger is like a volcanic eruption. So would you build a house next to a volcano that only erupts every once in a while? And that really meant something to me.
Yeah.
And with time elapsed, now I'm not even sure that it's true that I got angry just once in a while. And regardless of the point holds, and my fits of rage caused trauma in which my other abusive behaviors during the times in between those angry episodes were filtered. And then another thing that I've learned a lot about is safety. I thought of safety previously only in terms of physical safety and somewhat limited. And I think that's important. My counselor helped me understand that while I'm not a particularly big or muscular man, I was quite a bit taller than my wife and kids. And I have a voice that can carry, and I was intimidating. And mix that with the angry vitriol, and it was not physically safe. But I've also learned that it's important to think of safety in terms of emotional safety. Is it safe for someone to express their own opinion without a fear of a snarky cowman? Is it safe for them to express their emotions, ranging from anxiety and fear to joy and happiness, without feeling suppressed or shamed or made to feel guilty or a counterpoint coming? And so I want to be a safe person in all expressions of safety. So those are, I think, a couple of the big things that I've learned along the way.
That's very important. The one allowing emotion. I wasn't allowed to have any emotion at all. There was no right reaction for me. So I'm so thankful that you've recognized that, and that is an important thing.
Yeah, because that's
That's a
just
big,
as important to be able to express your emotions too. So what are some other things that you can think of that can prevent others from being abused?
That's a hard question to answer. I think the very first thing when I heard you ask that question that popped in my mind was the idea of encouraging individuals to express themselves and seek help. And yet when one's in an abusive situation, they don't likely feel safe to do so. Probably because it's not.
Yeah.
And still, it's important to seek help. So talking to a teacher or a counselor or a pastor and tell them what you're experiencing. But beyond that, I think learning what boundaries are and how to establish them is really imperative. There's some pretty seminal works out there on the topic, and I think it's good to learn about them and from them. And I think that might be one of the most helpful tools for preventing further hurt and harm and destruction from abuse.
Yeah, our podcast that just came out today is on boundaries.
Yeah.
With Patrick Doyle.
We just did one on boundaries.
Yeah. So that's great. Now our listeners can listen to that as well. So what are some of the other things that you did to heal?
Well, I've sought counseling and I still see a therapist, gone through some educational classes. I have read voraciously. I've gone through the Celebrate Recovery 12-step program, attend church services weekly. I attend Celebrate Recovery gatherings nearly every week. And I attend step study meetings at a pretty similar pace. And so those have provided instruments of healing, vehicles, I guess. But I've also sought out new friendships. So I've reached out to men for mentorship as well. And now I'm mentoring a man and willing to help a number of others. And those things have helped in my healing. And in seasons, I've found prayer and prayer journaling specifically to be really helpful for my healing. And I think while I've done a lot of healing, I still have a lot more to come. And I guess with that idea, I found that allowing myself to dream about the future, all the way from what hobbies I might want to look into to where I'd like to go on vacation someday, they offer hope for healing to come and the purpose for healing.
Yeah, that's great.
What I found interesting, and this isn't in the questions, is that you said that you did not realize how your behavior, like I guess you didn't realize how you were behaving was abusive or how you were treating others was abusive. Like, I feel like my ex-husband did realize what he was doing. Do you see differences in that when you are helping other men?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to realize there were moments that I was aware of what I was doing was having a response in that situation, trying to control one's environment, trying to control people through the situation. But I do think I lacked an awareness of the totality of what was happening. And so I think it's important for me to admit that and share that there was an element of me understanding some of what I was doing. I think Bancroft talks a little bit about the idea that you really never lose control because there were so many things you didn't do, right? So something of value didn't get broken. Well, that's interesting because you were having a tirade and other things may have gotten damaged, is what Bancroft would argue. So with that, though, I do find that there are levels of awareness and also levels of being willing to take responsibility for that and understanding that even if you weren't fully aware, it doesn't mean you still weren't responsible for it. And then trying to better understand how maybe you felt and how those things have helped you. And if you can give me the grace here of the quick question and just reflecting on it, that in the 12-step program, any 12-step program, step 4 is really important in terms of doing a spiritual moral inventory. And that process is to be balanced. So those things that we harbored resentments, but also those things that bring us joy. But I have come to realize that step is really important, not simply for blaming, but for explaining. And so I think as you shared, some of the difference is that being able to begin to understand why something may be occurring and then doing the work to change those responses. You might still feel anxious. You might still feel inadequate, but there's an opportunity to respond differently in that situation. And so as you're sharing that continuum of awareness, I think once one does become aware, then there's an opportunity for them to do the work to change that response and that behavior.
So as far as growing in self-awareness, do you think that was from you being able to grow in self-awareness? Was that a combination of having therapy and having that group accountability? Because I think that's so important, having a growing sense of self-awareness.
Yes.
I think it is. I think it's really important to continue to grow in self-awareness. Part of your question there is identifying what are some of those things that helped. I've been really, really fortunate to have been able to seek out a counselor. I've been really, really fortunate to have mentors speak into my life. I've been very fortunate to have friends that have been willing to listen to me and come alongside me. I've been fortunate to be part of some different groups, everything from the anger management class to the abuser group to Celebrate Recovery. And so there is the support there. And then I think with Celebrate Recovery specifically, being able to have those individuals that want to engage in accountability. So being able to ask some of those tougher questions, all of those, I think, have provided or at least fostered an environment of reflection. And I think they've fostered an environment where I want to become more aware of how I'm feeling, but also how someone else may be feeling, and moving from myself to someone else in the room and being sensitive to them, being able to observe what they're going through. And so I think it's been a process. I think it continues. I think as I've mentioned before, still have a lot of work to do in that area, and having that self-awareness of, oh, that's how I'm feeling right now, sometimes is quick enough to be able to move to the more positive behavior. Not always, but sometimes it's really helpful.
Yeah.
To be able to identify, I am feeling this. And I have come across, there are some really good references and materials out there that have lists of feelings. And I did one activity where I actually looked up a variety of those feelings in the dictionary so that I would better understand what those feelings were, so that I could better identify when I was going through something. Oh, well, that is this particular feeling. And then that would help me move in. And I think that was helpful too.
Yeah.
Very
Brenda
helpful.
Brown has a book out called Atlas of the Heart. I haven't read it yet, but it's one of her newer books. But her whole book is about being able to put words to your feelings. I mean, I just read the introduction, but I thought it's going to be a powerful book, because that is a big part of, I know like counselors have done that to me too, where they give you this big list. You're like, I don't know what I'm feeling. And then, you see all these different words. I'm like, oh, it's really like getting specifically, more specific about it, which is important.
Yeah. And jumping off of that, I found, so one is I think it's wonderful that counselors do provide that, because sometimes we don't know what we're feeling. But the second is, when I first received that list, or I remember my counselor giving me a list and looking at it, and I felt a little overwhelmed. And I've found some lists in which they're categorized, and that was really helpful, so that I could move to, well, oh yeah, that fits, or skipping over a whole section. No, that's not how I'm feeling, which was really helpful too. So I think it's interesting that Brene Brown's title of the book is Atlas, because I do think we probably need a roadmap to better understanding what those underlying feelings are.
Yeah. And that's kind of what she's saying. It's kind of set up like an atlas. The book looks like an atlas too.
We'll have to look at that.
Yeah. She's got an HBO special, which I haven't been getting as much out of as her book, but yeah, I think she's fascinating.
Well, the only reason I brought up that question before about the different types of abusers, like them knowing what, because Andrew Bauman had mentioned something on that last podcast we did with him. He talked about the ones that actually know what they're doing, and then the ones that just don't really have a clue.
I think it was the How Not to Be an Ass.
Yeah.
one.
And that's why I kind of mentioned that, because I wondered what your opinion was on that. But yeah, that was the only reason I kind of brought that up, because I'm wondering. I think there are some that, a sociopath knows exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, like he was saying, some just don't. And there's a big difference. Well, we just want to thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story. I know it's not easy, and it's nice to have more men that are able to look at themselves.
Yes.
And that's very encouraging. So we know that most abusers do not change, but that you prove that it is possible. It definitely is possible. With God, all things are possible. So this podcast is to educate and help people heal from abuse, but also stopping abuse is critical. So we just love your effort to educate and stop abuse. So anything else you'd want to say? You want to add to it? Or
just thank you for the opportunity to share. And I do hope that individuals that are listening, those that have been abused, will be able to get the support and the healing that they need. I think that has been really important for me to advocate for that. And then secondly, for those that have realized that they have caused hurt and harm and destruction to others, that they might set about a path to begin the process of healing, but also some self-discovery for changing the direction that they've gone.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And if anybody listens to the podcast and even if it's a man and they, like when you called and reached out to Mike, is there anywhere for that person to go, or what do you recommend a resource if they listen to this podcast and they say, okay, this is a step I want to take?
Yeah.
Or the wife listens to it and the husband says this, I want to take these steps to make some changes. Like what should they do? Where could they go? I guess is what I'm saying. Is there resources out there?
There are resources out there. The National Domestic Violence Hotline does have a list of batterer intervention and or abuser and or offender groups, and you can call that number and they will provide you with a directory.
Okay.
And in full disclosure, that's actually how I found the offender group that I participated in, and I thought that was very, very helpful. So I think being able to go through, because they may be located in different parts, and so to give one specific direction might not provide them with the help they need, but that hotline was really helpful for me, and it provided me with a safe place to talk and a safe place to be able to receive that directory. If individuals want to take the next step in their personal growth and they want to receive those educational materials, I think a program like that is really helpful. I also recommend, as we discussed, being able to get that support group. And I think Celebrate Recovery has provided that for me also. You can go to the Celebrate Recovery website and it will show where the large group gatherings are meeting and which nights of the week and what time. And there oftentimes is contact information for the individual that is heading up that particular Celebrate Recovery all across the country, and then also really the globe as well. And I think that could be a good place. And then if individuals are interested in some additional help or conversations within the Phoenix area, folks could go to the Impact Church Celebrate Recovery page, and they can use the general email address and then reference my name, Steve I. I can get back to them pretty quickly that way also.
All right. So you started out by calling 1-800-799-7233. Is that
That's correct.
Domestic Violence Hotline? Okay. So we're just going to give that out. And we just hope that anyone this can help. This is what our podcast is all about.
Yeah, definitely.
So if you go through that Domestic Violence Hotline, it will direct you to these different programs, right?
That's what I told them. Yeah, I called and said, can you direct me to a batterer intervention program? And they asked where I was at. And I gave them an address and they gave me a list of, I think it was 2 or 3. And then I reached out to another friend and said, hey, I remember a conversation. And they said, well, I recommend this one. And it was one of those 3. And so that's the one I got enrolled in. So, but the point is, yes, the National DV Hotline will help provide those resources.
That's great. So when you talk to them, you just explained that you were the one that was being abusive and wanted help with that?
That's correct. I told them that I called them and I told them that I had struggled with being abusive, that I was separated from my family, that my wife and children were in a safe place, but that I was the transgressor. They were the injured. Was there a place that they would recommend a batterer intervention program for me? And then that's where we went from there. So that's how I started it. I made sure, number one, they knew that my family was not with me, therefore they were safe. So it was not an emergency situation for them. Secondly, that I was the transgressor, they were the injured. And then thirdly, I needed help. Did they have any referrals? And they helped me. And I try to be as transparent as possible. I actually called them twice. So I called them one time and then I called them back. And I was bawling when I called them the first time. So it was a little more coherent the second time.
I didn't realize that you could do that at all until I talked to you just right now.
I didn't either, but I tried it.
This is exciting for me. Like, I know this sounds stupid, but this is exciting for me because if more men reach out and realize and get help, then this is going to help prevent abuse.
Yeah, it's important.
So, I mean, we're trying to figure out every way to, you can't completely stop it, but any way that you can help in the world is big. And so this is I'm just so grateful that you did this.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
We just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast. We really appreciate you sharing your story.
Yes, we really do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening. And until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.